Good morning. Now, you see, that's the level of discussion that we want throughout the rest of the day. So you just keep this going, but after our speakers. So, welcome everyone. Really delighted to see you all here this morning. Really delighted to be hosting our annual conference back in Edinburgh again, the first time in at least 10 years that we've hosted a major conference here. So, really pleased to see you all here, and welcome to those of you who are joining online. A couple of housekeeping points, as always, before we start. There's no fire drill expected, so if the fire alarm goes or an automated voice tells us to leave the building, then please do so by the fire exit so you can see, and staff at the venue will help us out. There's a photographer, as you've probably noted already, around the venue. If you don't want your picture taken, just let us know. Let someone in the team know. We're also, throughout the day, using the hashtag #MakingChange on social media. So if you're still one of those few people who are using Twitter, then you can use it on there. If you've joined us all on Blue Sky, then you can do that, or Instagram, or wherever you find yourself. We want the discussion to take place, not just in this room, but outside. The workshops, they're on your badges. The Carrick Suite, the Kilsyth, the Tinto, Moorcroft and Harris. It's very Scottish. So that's on your badge. Staff can help guide you to those workshops when they come after this session. And finally, anyone who's claiming expenses to be here today, if you could see Isla at the main registration desk at lunchtime, she'll be able to help you out, or someone from the admin team will be able to help. So that's the housekeeping done. We're coming here together today at the end of a year that was billed at the start of this year as being a big one for democracy. There were more than 4 billion people estimated to have the right to vote in new leaders and new governments this year. But I think what we've seen throughout this year too often is less a festival of democracy, and what we've actually witnessed is a deepening of polarisation, a worrying rise in right-wing nationalism, and the continued decline in trust in politics and politicians. And for those of us who are seeking progressive change, which is all of us in this room, I think, who want to address poverty in all its forms, who want to reverse the decline in living standards, tackle discrimination, or make sure that everyone has a decent home, that divided and divisive context is a serious challenge. So today's conference is all about how we address that challenge. How do we make change happen when it can sometimes feel like the odds are stacked against us? Now, I firmly believe, many of you who know me will know that I'm an optimist and a hopeful person, but I firmly believe that despite this really difficult context, there are still opportunities to make progress, still opportunities where we can defend and expand rights, where we can make progressive policy and real change in communities at the local level. But that progress can only come from us in civil society when we act together. So what we'll spend today doing is how we figure out how best to act together, how we combine our resources, how we learn from each other, how we can use different strategies to make change happen. We've got a host of fantastic speakers here, and I really will encourage you to take an active part in today's discussion, to listen, to engage with those speakers and all the other participants here today. We'll have contributions, we all have contributions to make when it comes to making change happen. Now, something a wee bit different this year at our annual conference. Almost every year we have a senior politician to open the discussion. And you'll have noted from the agenda that this is a politician-free event. And I think that's in keeping with the theme of today, and to use that old saying or old quote, I think Obama used to use it a lot, but it's not his, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. This is a year for us as the Poverty Alliance to consider how we marshal our resources, how we prioritise and work together. And to be honest, we don't really need another politician coming here to tell us how tough it is to make the tough decisions that they have to make. We know that, we hear that. We don't need to hear it in this room today. What we have instead is to open our session today, 3 really powerful and inspirational speakers, ones who have been working hard to make social, economic and environmental change happen. We're going to hear from each of them in turn and then have some time for questions and discussion afterwards. So first, I'd like to introduce Danesh Suskandaraja, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the New Economics Foundation. Dani, as I'm sure many of you will know, has had a long career leading a number of really important global civil society organisations. Oxfam GB, Civicus, the Royal Commonwealth Society. That's a wealth of experience that Dani is bringing here today on how civil society around the world is responding to the challenges that we face. He's going to share with us some of that knowledge and some of the key lessons that emerge in his recent new book, Power to the People, which I really can't recommend highly enough. It's an excellent book. Something for Christmas, perhaps. So, with no further ado, Dani, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I came up from London last night. I love coming to Scotland for lots of reasons, not just the Iron Brew, but because whenever I come, it feels like there's always a different energy here when it comes to social justice, to equality, to fairness, and whether it's the conversations you're having about the minimum income guarantee with your government, whether it's the wonderful work that my former colleagues in Oxfam Scotland are doing around inequality and making polluters pay. There is a real energy that I wish we had more of down south in Westminster. I also love coming here because you do some fantastic events, and the very last time I was in this building was a couple of years ago for the People's Postcode Lottery Gala dinner. I don't know if anyone was here. And a little-known Scottish band called Texas performed. And I want to quote Charlene Spiteri to begin. So this is from Black Eyed Boy, a famous song from Texas in the late 90s. And this is going to be what I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes. No, I don't lack ambition. Can't you see what I hate? That it's you who is sinking, locked behind iron gates. You should know you're falling into fiction. I can tell you're on some foolish mission. And I want to use those words because I think that after 20-odd years of knocking about in civil society, trying to make change happen, I've come to the conclusion, and that's what the book is all about, is that if we're going to have any chance of succeeding in our mission of making the world far more just, far more sustainable, we have to get smart about how the system is working against us. Those of us who are interested in ending poverty and in empowering people have been sort of watching in horror about what is happening, not just in our own country, but around the world in the last few years. You know, we thought we were riding this amazing wave of growth, of development, that everyone in the world would be richer and better off, that the rising tide will lift all boats. But instead, the very opposite is happening. Almost everywhere in the world, poverty and inequality is rising. Almost everywhere in the world, we're not doing enough to avoid disastrous climate breakdown. Always everywhere in the world, the deep injustices that have kept women from fully achieving their potential, that have kept racialized minorities from fully achieving their potential, that have kept people living with disabilities from fully achieving their potential. Those injustices are still there. They're stubbornly holding on and preventing a genuine equality. And I've been asking myself, why? Why is that? And I think there are three things that we need to do that I want to just talk briefly about. They're all about systemic change. One is about changing the way that our economy works. Two is about changing the way that our politics work. And three is changing the way that we work in civil society. I want to cover off each in turn. So let's turn to the economy. I work at the New Economics Foundation these days. It was created exactly 40 years ago. In 1984, Margaret Thatcher was hosting the G7 leaders, including Ronald Reagan, in London, and a bunch of ecologists and alternative economists were worried that what became called Thatcherism or Reaganomics or neoliberalism, they were worried at the time, 40 years ago, that left unchecked, this neoliberal orthodoxy would ravage the planet, would leave us all feeling worse off, would pull back the state and the protections that were so hard won, the labor rights that were hard won. And for 40 years, there's an organization that's been trying to challenge that orthodoxy. And here we are in 2024, and I think we have lost the battle on so many fronts, and we need to, I think, come together and say, if we're going to have any chance of ending poverty, of reducing it meaningfully, we have to change the way that the economy works. But I'm here, Peter told me, to inspire you for action and to make today feel positive. And the reason I'm here and the reason I'm so excited about civil society and our role is I think the key to unleashing a genuinely inclusive economy sits in rooms like this. Like if I was to say, who is going to help transform society? Is it the state? Is it business? Or is it citizens, activists, people like us? I'd put money on us. Because I think the really exciting bits of fundamentally redrawing our economy, I think, sit within civil society. I'm really excited, for example, about what's happening in the cooperative sector. So 3% of the UK GDP is produced by cooperatives of one form or another. Some of them are decades, hundreds of years old. And so the answer, if we really want to have a more equitable society, a more equal economy, I think in part lies in really strengthening the work of what's happening in cooperatives. And I'm inspired by what's happening by community energy groups who are building renewable energy initiatives, but through community ownership. I'm excited about the Equal Care Cooperative. The idea that social care, which is so chronically undervalued in society, where caregivers, those who are paid, are so chronically underpaid, that the solution to that is not just fighting for rights and minimum wage and standards, that's really important, but trying to think ahead and say, how do we create a care economy that itself treats everyone involved with greater dignity? And to me, that is about mutualism and cooperativism. So there's an example there about how we can tackle or make the economy work fairer. Let me give you another example of some amazing, brave activism around the economy. One, that it's about wealth and the fact that we have been sleepwalking into an inequality crisis around wealth. How is it possible that in the last 14 years, in this country, in the UK, that if you happen to have been in the top 1% of wealth holders in 2010, by this year, your average per capita wealth has increased by £2.2 million. 41 times more than the average increase in wealth experienced by the average British person. And yet, we tax wealth so low compared to how we, those of us who have to earn a living through hard work get taxed a certain rate. That's important. If we want to pay for our public services, we need to make our contribution. But if you happen to collect your income because you own assets and those assets are increasing in value, society says, we can't tax you. And it's not just in the UK. Only 4% of taxes globally are collected on wealth of some form or another, 96% through work or consumption. That's not right in a world where the wealth holders are getting eye-wateringly rich or richer as well. But why am I bringing it back to civil society? Well, I came back from Rio de Janeiro last week from the G20 summit, which is the 20 biggest economies in the world. Those sort of conversations that have been happening over the last few years that have been all about driving globalization, driving productivity or whatever, all the buzzwords that economists usually talk about. I came away inspired because for the first time in that communique that leaders agreed to last week in Rio is a recognition that the global economy is not sustainable unless we do something about wealth inequality. that the G20 leaders have agreed that they will explore creating a tax on the super rich. They're going to start, I hope, with billionaires, the several thousand people who are billionaires. And if you'd asked me 3 or 4 years ago, would G20 leaders, the leaders of the biggest economy in the world, agree that wealth inequality was a problem? I said, no, don't be silly. They're never going to do that. But why are they doing that? Why have they done that? It's because of the activism and the persistence of people in rooms like this, who've worked tirelessly to make the case for why we need international coordinated action on wealth inequality. It's people who've been looking at the research, producing the research, the evidence to say that actually poverty exists in today's world, not because of scarcity, but because of maldistribution. That the real problem is inequality that's driving poverty. And so whether it's cooperatives or whether it's campaigning on wealth taxes, it's people in rooms like this that are going to make this change we need happen to fundamentally rewire our economy so that we can end poverty for good. Politics, and Peter said this just now, is supposed to be the system, or the political system is supposed to be how in democracies we're supposed to make change, right? Democracy was supposed to be about delivering power to us, the people, that we would be able to shape our common future by taking part in democracy. And this year, as Peter said, was supposed to be the sort of peak year for democracy, billions of us voting. What's actually happening is a system that is wholly inadequate to to manifest the collective wishes of people around the world is being challenged in all sorts of ways. Apathy is one. 19 million of us chose not to vote in the last UK general election. That's many, many more people than actually voted for the Labour Party. And all around the world, in South Africa and India in recent elections, really scaringly, young people chose not to vote in record numbers because they don't believe that this system of elections, of politics, of party politics is working for them. Why? It's because we've been led to believe that somehow voting once every few years for political parties that look increasingly similar or increasingly radical in the sort of populist way is the best way of expressing our collective will. When we've known as humans that there are far better ways of doing it. Right? And in some ways, the democracy we have today, the democratic institutions, the systems we have today, are a relic of a 19th century settlement in which elites were brought into our system. How do we have an unelected second chamber in this country, the world's second largest legislative chamber? Only China's People's National Assembly is bigger than our House of Lords. We have 700-odd people. I have lost count because they keep adding more lords. In our legislative chamber, 7% of whom are former party activists, members, or donors. That's not democracy, and I think most people see through that. They say voting once every few years for parties that look increasingly similar, that don't deliver us a genuinely better life, a system that looks corrupt, a system in which people behave out of self-interest, is not sustainable. The Gallup organization has done a poll for decades in this country asking people, do you believe that elected officials act in the best interests of the country? In the 1960s and 70s, huge proportions of us thought that our elected officials did act in the best interests of the country. Last year, that poll showed only 7% of us believe that our elected officials act in the best interests of the country, and nearly 2/3 of us think that they act in their own interests. That's not sustainable. Put all that together, it's not sustainable. But why am I optimistic, or why am I hopeful? It's because the answers to building a far more deliberative democracy in which people feel more meaningfully engaged with political life and decisions, I think lies in our hands. Because we need the creativity to show that new and better ways of making decisions together can happen. And I'm inspired, for example, by civil society organizations that are working through citizens' assemblies, for example, convening groups of people, randomly selected, to talk through tough decisions, whether it's climate change or abortion rights. that there are really amazing examples when we've been able to bypass mainstream political decision-making and come up with more creative solutions. I'm inspired by campaigns. I'm very supportive of the ones that are being run to replace the House of Lords with a House of the People. Why can't we do that? Why couldn't we have a second chamber that actually involves people randomly selected to serve for, say, 2 or 3 year terms, much like we would on jury duty, that would be there to look at the big decisions that politicians find too difficult to make, whether we should be in or out of the EU, whether we should legalize assisted dying. These are the sorts of things where we need the moral authority of people thinking together, working together in a deliberative form. And the people who are leading that sort of thinking, very unpopular and unfashionable in this country for some reason, are civil society activists who are campaigning for a radically better democracy. And so whether it's rewiring our economy to be fundamentally fairer, and whether it's rewiring our politics to give people more a meaningful voice, I think the responsibility lies with us to lead the way and show that another world is possible. But let me conclude by saying the only way that's going to happen, though, I think, and this is drawing on some own lessons over the last 25, 30 years, is that we have to change the way that we work in civil society. Because I am worried that we're losing in part because we're not organizing in the right way. That in some ways we've become very reliant on professionalized, organized bits of civil society, the NGOization of social change that many people have noticed in the last few decades, that those organized, professionalized bits of civil society aren't particularly good at working with the rest of civic action, that sometimes those of us who work in NGOs end up instrumentalizing social movements or community partners, that the level playing field between the big NGOs and the small ones is problematic, that the big ones start to crowd others out, take up space and profile and hog resources, that we don't work particularly well across issues. That when, the fight for equal workers' rights, to me, is the same as the fight for social justice, is the same as the fight for racial justice. And if we don't get better at thinking at the intersectional ways in which those struggles are related, then we're lost. And so I think if we're going to have any chance of making change happen, we ourselves need to look at ourselves and the privileges that we hold as individuals, the organizations, if we work for them, and the power and privilege that we might hold, and how we nurture a world, how we be the change we want to see in the world. How do we model the practices of feminist leadership, of true inclusion in the work that we do? And I think if we do all of those sort of things, challenge the systems of economic power, change the way that power works rather than just obsessing with changing the people in power, and change the way that we work, we can make change happen in a really powerful, inspiring way. And I look forward to coming back to Scotland to hear how you guys have done that in the years to come. Let me just close with Charlene again, because if we don't, this is what's going to happen. Well, I know you don't lack the ambition. I can see what you hate. But we're not going to fall into fiction. We're not on some foolish mission. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Danny. And almost a session of karaoke there. Almost. We got a sing along. Almost. That's for later. That's after the conference. Delighted to hear all of that, Danny. I think you've hit on the points that we will return to throughout the day in terms of our discussion. I'm really pleased that Ros Foyer, who, as I'm sure all of you know, is the General Secretary of the STUC, is joining us today. Ros has been an active trade unionist throughout her life before she was paid by trade unions to be an active trade unionist. She'd been active in this in worker struggles throughout her life, and I think she brings that incredible depth of experience to her work with the STUC. She was the first woman to be appointed General Secretary of the STUC back in 2020, and I think since that time we've seen the STUC, even more than they have been in the past, mobilised as an important campaigning force in Scotland. You will hear Ros discussing issues not only about the struggles of workers and the important fights that are going on just now, but also about issues around climate change and racial justice. And I know there's an important demo taking place in Glasgow tomorrow on that issue. So, with no more introductions, Ros, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and I really am very excited and grateful for the invitation to come and address you today. I really do think that the anti-poverty movement and the trade union movement need to be working hand in glove if we're going to effectively tackle poverty and rebalance wealth in our society. We can be powerful, powerful allies in that struggle. And I'm really delighted also to follow Danny's excellent contribution, because I share the view that democratising our economies and investing in real activism is crucial if we're going to make change happen. And I want to start by just sharing my thoughts about trade unions. Ignore the screen behind me, I'm pressing the buttons by mistake, so just ignore that. Sorry. So I want to start by just talking a bit about some of our experiences in making change happen. And I'm not here to tell you that we've got all the answers, far from it. We are on a journey of learning and rebuilding and organising ourselves. But I do want to highlight some key steps that I think all of us need to consider if we're serious about real, deep, transformational change in our society. And the first thing I want to say to you is that we've been busy in the last few years as a movement here in Scotland. We've seen over the last 2 years just over 1,000 different industrial actions and strike actions taking place with groups of workers across Scotland. And that's involved more than 360,000 workers who've stood up and taken action and joined together and collectivised. And that's workers in schools, colleges, universities, our councils, our railways, our buses, our post offices, across whole big swathes of the private sector and across parts of the voluntary sector, who've all taken a very difficult decision, because often these are very low-paid workers who are living in poverty, but they've taken a decision that enough is enough to take action, and it's either to get a decent pay rise on the table, but sometimes it's about getting cuts to their services taken off the table. And the fact remains that taking that strike action largely works. It has delivered incredible results. Our research shows that through collective bargaining, workers in Scotland have won more than £4.5 billion, but more than £3 billion of that wouldn't have been put on the table if it hadn't been for those workers coming together and taking that industrial action. It was money that the bosses and the politicians claimed wasn't there until the workers stood up and fought for it. So that money wouldn't have been in the hands of the working class if those workers hadn't fought back and acted collectively and been active. And because of that, our union showed last year a net growth of 30,000 workers joining trade unions across Scotland, which is one of the most significant rises in trade union membership that we've seen in recent years. And I think if the past 40 years has taught us anything, it's that justice is not achieved by asking nicely or by lobbying or just being in the room. It is through agitation. And we've taken that agitation into the political arena because we're fed up with being in the room. The Scottish Government in particular has been very good at having us in the room, but that doesn't make real change happen. And we need our politicians to know that we're going to keep causing trouble, frankly, if they don't deliver real change for us. That's our job, as far as I'm concerned. So the trade union movement and the anti-poverty movement are united by common values, by often common demands. And we're also united, I think, in our view that we need to have a government at every level that's committed to rebuilding our social security, rebuilding our infrastructure, our housing and our public services. And Labour's UK budget, it was a start. It was a bit of a turning point in terms of direction, but it was a start from a very low bar. And we saw borrowing rules redressed. We saw £40 billion of tax rises, about £70 billion of new investment going into our economy. But it could have gone so much further. It could have gone further on areas like corporation tax, wealth tax, capital gains tax. And that could have raised revenues that would easily have covered winter fuel allowance for our pensioners. It could easily have lifted the two-child benefit cap and a whole host of other things that we know need to happen. And at a Scottish level, we need to see our politicians being bolder too. The truth is that taxes are just going to have to rise for the rich, and we're going to have to tax wealth, because if we want Scandinavian levels of public services, we can't have that on American levels of taxation, and that's what we've got at the moment. So it's us that need to make those arguments. In my experience, politicians don't lead, they follow the public narrative and they follow the public opinion. So, you know, it's up to us to do that. But let's not forget we've made progress. I've got no doubt that the Scottish Government wouldn't have introduced a new tax rate last year for those who earn over $75,000 in Scotland if it hadn't been for organisations like the STUC and a whole range of others who are sitting in this room calling for that, pushing for that and making those arguments in the public narrative and opening up the doors on a grown-up debate about taxation. But we also need to be clear about what's at stake, because if we don't make that progress faster and stronger and more meaningful and more immediate for people on the ground, then it's going to get really, really difficult. For me, the centre-left politicians across our aisles are really in the last chance saloon of public opinion. If they let the people down again, then I think people are going to start looking to the far right for answers. And that is a danger that I think is growing greater every single day. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that they have a very simple, they're very, very sophisticated. They have a very effective and simple story to tell. And I'm going to tell it briefly, so forgive me, because I want to illustrate this point. So the reason that your living standards are worse, that your public services don't work, that your town is run down is because your out-of-touch politicians have let the migrants come and steal your jobs and your benefits while being fixated with woke issues like climate change and identity politics. Now, we know that this story is utterly false and it belongs in a moral cesspit, but it is a very compelling story. It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, it's got an end. It identifies the problems, it identifies who the baddies and the villains of the piece are, and it also, importantly, has a grain of truth. Living standards are falling, public services don't work, politicians are out of touch. And there's another story, though, that we need to tell and that needs to be told, and it's also connected with the material conditions of the working class, and it identifies the real villains of the piece. But we've all got to get a lot better at telling that story on the ground and in our communities. And that's the story of the boss that exploits their workers because they know they can get away with it because of weak employment rights. That's the landlord that hikes up the rents in a mouldy flat because they can. That's the energy companies that make record profits on us during a cost-of-living crisis. That's the big private care homes that hide their profits in the Cayman Islands. It's the rolling stock train companies that extract ever more profits from our railways and they fail to invest in new stock. It's the billionaire owner of Manchester United Football Club that wants to replace our last oil refinery in Scotland with an import-export terminal just because it's more profitable, instead of our government investing in green fuel refinery for the future. It's the hedge funds, it's the city bankers that destabilise our economy and distort our markets and distort our politics and our budgets. And I could go on and on and on for hours about all of these things, but I think my key point is that it's our job not to defend the way things are, not to say sometimes, you know, everything's getting better. It's actually our job to educate, agitate and organise, and to harness that anger that people quite rightly feel in their communities and make sure that we're directing it where we should go. And that is up at the rich and the powerful and the decision makers, not down at the most vulnerable in our communities. So we do need to get better at telling those stories. We need to pick up a page or two out of the playbook of the other side. And it's not just clever framing, that is important, but it's also about ensuring that the issues we talk about are rooted in the material concerns of the people that we represent and that we work with. It's listening to people's voices and what those concerns are. It's making sure those voices are escalated into the leadership of our organisations, and it's ensuring that people that have got real life experience operate at all levels within our movements and lead our movements. And, you know, if we look at some of the great working class revolutionaries and reformers in Scottish society, John Maclean, Mary Barber, John Wheatley, Jenny Lee, Mick McGahey, Jimmy Reid, these people could tell compelling stories because they'd lived it. And they could identify solutions in real drivers because they knew the issues that were affecting the working class, and they benefited very much from self-education of the working class. There was a level of political education that they'd benefited from, and I would say we need to get back to that, educating people, really, you know, not college education degrees, I mean like community education and working with people, and that's something we're looking at through the trade union movement at the moment, because if we don't plant those seeds of working class education, if we don't nourish and grow our movements, then we're not going to be able to build the power and build the demands in the way that we need to, that are going to be effective and are going to shift the public narrative the way that we need to. And we've got no shortage of demands, but the task ahead is to work together. We need to connect up all of our demands into a huge, big, angry movement that demands change and demands it now. And that's going to take deep organising. It's going to take a lot of resources and a lot of effort. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen by magic. It happens through conversations and hard work and people being passionate and caring and working with each other and putting the effort in. And they need to see hope, and they need to see the small wins getting won, to know that they're capable of making the big wins happen. So, you know, that sustained and escalating pressure can make a difference to what our politicians choose to do and choose not to do, but we need to build that anger and build that pressure. And it's no easy task, but little worth doing if it is. But the one thing that I do know and that I have seen throughout my working life is that when the working class unites and fights back, we do make real change happen. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rose. That was brilliant, as I expected, and you've also given us the name for our next conference, which is Keep Causing Trouble, I think, from making change happen to keeping causing trouble. But I think Rose, again, has hit on the points that we absolutely need to focus on throughout our discussions today, and that will be picked up throughout the, through the workshops, about how we actually come together, about what the strategies are that we put together to make change happen. Our final speaker on the panel here is Laura Young, who again will undoubtedly be familiar to many of you. Laura is a climate activist, an environmental scientist, an ethical influencer, and I have to say, influencer of the year 2024 in Scotland. Some of you who know what influencer, yeah. Some of you who understand better what influencers are can explain that to me later, but congratulations, Laura. I think she's been prominent not only in the work that she's done internationally now. I heard her most recently reporting back from the COP conference in Baku, but also the really important campaigning work she did around disposable vapes, I think, which is also really well known. She's also well known in my house because she's featured in a book called Spectacular Women, Spectacular Scottish Women, which my daughter pulls off the shelf at every opportunity and shows me, so well done on achieving that as well. She's going to talk to us today about what we can learn from campaigns for climate justice. I think, as Danny and Roz have mentioned, there are connections here, and we need to make those connections more immediate and more alive. So Laura's going to talk to us a bit about that, and how we can also, I think, really importantly, engage younger people. Again, as Danny said, that disenchantment with politics is a real challenge. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much. And if I had the choice, I would have gone first because I don't really know how to follow that. But yeah, it's so wonderful to be here and see some familiar faces and also see new people, because I think part of what is great about this is bringing people together. And yeah, I do lots of different work. And I am still on Twitter. I'm also on TikTok. Do you know what that is, Peter? Yeah, it's part of being an influencer. No, but it's great. And I was asked to come here to answer 4 questions in a short reflection. So I thought I would pose you the questions and then I'll give you my answers. The first one was, what sustains people in the campaign for climate justice? And I think there's 2 simple answers to this. One is the science. We know what's happening and we know the stories and the statistics. So that drives you. Part of my day job is I'm doing a PhD, right? I'm in the thick of it when it comes to it. So we are driven by science, statistics and stories. We are knowing what is happening. But what also drives and sustains us is that we know the solutions exist. We know what the solutions are to climate change. We know how we need to reduce our emissions. We know what we need to do to be more sustainable. We just need to get a move on. And that really is what drives us in that. And then the second question I was posed was, well, what lessons can be applied from climate, environmental campaigning, and how do we apply that to tackling poverty? And I've been part of lots of different campaigns, and I see lots of colleagues in the rooms where there's been coalitions of organisations campaigning. But we've also done campaigning on things like the disposable vapes. You've probably seen me moan about that for long enough. But there's a few lessons that I think I've certainly been able to pull out of that. The first is that with all of our campaigning, we need to be as creative as possible. We need to showcase the problem in visible ways, and we need to use as many outlets as possible. And yes, that means TikTok, so you need to get on there. But we need to be able to do it in a way that helps people understand the problems. So sometimes when I'm talking about climate change or waste, it can be a little bit too big and a little bit too abstract. And so it's important for us to find the really specific things that will help. So with disposable vapes, we've ran a campaign now for almost 2 years, and we've got great success. They're getting banned next year, hopefully. But actually with that, a lot of my colleagues would say, why on earth are you spending so much time campaigning about this tiny little thing when there are so many bigger problems in the world? And I get it. I totally get it. But actually, disposable vapes was something tangible. It was something real. It was so understandable. People knew what they were. They'd seen them as litter. They'd heard stories about, or even maybe had a young person in their family who was taking it up at school, whatever it might be. So it was very, very understandable. And it galvanised a whole group of people to get on board. But also it was a gateway to talking about a much bigger issue. Well, actually 2. The first was this idea of disposable technology and just sheer horrible amounts of waste associated with throwaway technology, single-use plastic, and just a waste of resources. But it also opened up a conversation of this constant evolution of the tobacco and nicotine vaping industries. And so even though, yes, it was a very niche, tiny little topic, it actually gave us a way to crack open a whole world of conversations. And so, yes, we're going to get a great piece of legislation across the UK to deal with that, but actually we're able to do something a lot bigger. And that was a fantastic thing. But I think one of the most important lessons I learned was that we need to be collaborative. And so this campaign, it was a bit of guerrilla campaigning. It sort of started at the end of 2022 with some tweets and raging Zoom calls with colleagues and people that were interested. And slowly we started to build momentum. What was a few conversations on WhatsApp turned into a bit more formal Zoom calls, which then started almost like an unofficial coalition. But the one thing that I would say is crucial is that we never closed the door. We were always open for more organisations to come in. And initially it did start as a purely environmental thing. It was litter picking groups, it was Keep Scotland Beautiful, it was the Marine Conservation Society. But slowly we managed to snowball and bring in many different organisations. We had people across public health, we had Ash Scotland, we had youth workers, we had schools, parents, teachers, we even had car garages because they pop tyres and they were getting a bit annoyed about that. But the point there was that it just kept evolving and kept growing, and we never closed the door to new people coming in. And I don't think we would have got where we got to if we'd said, actually, sorry, this is just about the litter. We're not really worried about the youth impact or the health impact. We kept saying, open the door, keep having more people in. And so that really excites me about what we're all trying to do, because actually we all can collaborate more, and that was just a huge lesson. And actually, to Roz's point as well, often as a climate person, I get pitted against people. Oh, how could you possibly want to stand next to anyone from Grangemouth? Don't let that happen. Actually, that's where the collaboration is strongest, when you say, you can't pit us against each other because we're working together. We know each other. And I think that's important to make sure that that can't happen. The third question I was asked was, how can we better link tackling poverty and the climate crisis to get this just transition? I will say, I think there's terms that have been lost. They've been lost to polarisation. They've been, net zero, just transition. Sometimes when you say these words can set you off in the wrong direction. But I think it's important to actually tell the story of what that looks like. And certainly for me, I know that that's something that the environmental movement has not been good at. Often when you think about climate change, you maybe think of a tiny little iceberg with a little skinny polar bear on it, and that's kind of what you think about climate change. You think about it, something happening really far away to a polar bear that's starving. And that is something that we need to be concerned about. But actually, we need to widen our messaging and actually talk about what climate change and climate justice looks like. And I think that's important. And Roz talked about mouldy flats. And some of the research I've been doing as part of my PhD has been thinking about people and accommodation. And it's just shocking the amount of people that have that story. And as a climate activist, yes, I would like people to get insulation and double glazing to be saving carbon emissions. But I would also like it so that they have dignity in their house, so that they feel comfortable inviting their pals over to have a cup of tea, so that they aren't worried about the health impacts of breathing that in. It's not just about these carbon emissions that are floating around. It's about so much more than that. And there's a story I always share, because part of the work that I love to do is to go out and speak to amazing community groups who are doing all sorts of different projects. And Climate Action Straven is one of my favourites. And if you get the chance to go to Straven, go and meet them. Meet Alison in particular. She's fab. And that is, Straven's maybe got about 7,000 people. And it's one of these kind of fringe little villages, and it's beautiful. And they started a climate action group. And at first they said, well, I wonder what our community would like. Probably thinking they would say something like flower beds next to the high street. But actually the community said, we'd really like a bus into Glasgow, because Straven is this village that's very close to Glasgow, but was traditionally cut off. So if you wanted to go to Glasgow, you had to have a car to go maybe to East Kilbride or to Hamilton to then get a further bus or a train in. So it was a bit of a faff. And so the people of Straven were completely cut off to Glasgow unless you had a car and you were able to make this journey or get a taxi or whatever it might be. And so Climate Action Straven set out on this journey to get a bus. Now, first of all, they went to the bus companies and they said, go and just give us a bus route, that'd be really handy. And the bus company said, no, I don't think it'll be a profitable route, we don't see any value in it. So Climate Action Straven, long story short, are now Scotland's smallest bus operator. They have one bus route called the 3C. It runs from Straven into Glasgow, just next to Queen Street. And over the years, they started with one bus and a couple of drivers. And because of their financial model, meaning they can't make profit, they now have 3 buses and 8 bus drivers, and they run these services into Glasgow. And I think the last statistic I heard, which will already be out of date, is that even within the first sort of year of operation, they saved 100,000 trips into Glasgow. Now, as a climate activist, I'm like, isn't that great about all of those carbon emissions? But actually, one of the things that was most powerful is I was just down there a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying it's not just about the carbon emissions and the carbon footprint of climate action Straven. They said, this is why we do this. A mum had come in with tears in her eyes to the little hub, and she said, I just want to say thank you for all you've done to get this bus service. Because my daughter got a place at university in Glasgow. There was no way we were going to be able to afford her to get a flat in Glasgow. We don't have enough money to get her driving lessons, to get a car so that she could have got into Glasgow. And if it wasn't for her being under 22 and having the bus pass, and this bus being on our doorstep, she would never have been able to accept that position at that university and go and further her education. And that's just one story, right, that they've heard. But actually, that bus is so much more than just carbon emissions being saved. It's unlocking employment opportunities, educational opportunities, even just social conditions and opportunities for the people of Straven to get in and out of Glasgow. So if you want a good day out, go to Straven, get the bus. They also do a hot air balloon festival, which I did not know. So you can all get the bus to that next year. So expand the way we talk about things. And that's a lesson I've had to take on myself as well. Don't just talk about carbon emissions. And I've probably already talked a little bit too long. So I'll maybe go to the last question, which was, how can the anti-poverty movement better engage young people in our campaigning? Right, I'm pushing young, but my second name's Young, so forever young. But I think it's a really good question, because actually young people, I'm going by the karaoke theme, young people, they bring so much energy into our movements. And when I was in Straven, actually, I was giving talks at all the schools. It was exhausting, but I was giving all the talks at the schools about vapes. I'm dining out on the vape campaign for a bit longer, and I was talking about vapes. And this wee boy, he was in P7, he just stuck up his hand. I mean, P7s haven't gone to high school yet, so they still have all the questions in the world. They've not been conditioned to keep it in. And so after the talk, there was all these questions, and I was talking about, you know, tobacco and vapes and the health and the environment, and I was trying to do it in a way that they could understand to, you know, kind of help set in their ways, you know, what to do. And this wee boy just shot up his hand and he said, so you've told us all these bad things about cigarettes and vapes, and I'm just wondering, why are these companies even allowed to exist? And I was like, oh gosh, right, how do you explain? And the teacher's looking at me going, go on, I want to see how you answer that. But actually, young people help us because they just ask the questions that we are too scared to ask, or we've been in the systems too long. So bring in the voices, hold space for their questions, their lived experience. And sometimes that needs to look in a formal way. You know, can your organisation set up something that can bring in young people to hear their voices, support them, train them, maybe support them financially if you're taking a lot of their time, but think about how you can incorporate young people. And there's a million ways of doing it. So you can come and speak to me and say, what would that actually look like in practice? But even things like engage with our youth parliament as a first set of principles. So there you go. Because I think there's so much value in young people, and I think we need more young people even here. You know, even like today, what could we do to get more people in the room that don't quite understand Danny's Texas reference? I know I didn't, but But I think that's something we can ask ourselves is, you know, every room we're in, I know we need to do more than just getting them in the room, but, you know, how can we have some young people filling up these seats? Is it engaging with the high schools? Is it engaging with the youth parliament? Is it youth organisations? What is it? So that we can give away some of that power. So that was a few of my reflections on those 4 questions, but really looking forward to the conversation we have next. Thank you.
So the promised karaoke is still in the air. It might happen by the end of the day. We'll see. Thank you very much for that, Laura. I think, again, our last speaker there, tying together all the themes that we've heard throughout the morning so far. We've now got some time for questions. We've got maybe about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So we've got a couple of roving mics. I think there's one over there and there's one right here. we probably need to move over that way a wee bit. So could I see some hands? Because there are a lot of issues, there are a lot of questions that have been raised for me from our 3 contributions so far. So there must be questions from you. Oh, I can see one right in the middle. Can I see maybe a couple of hands up and then we can start going around? But Polly, if you just say who you are first and where you're from, if you're from an organisation, that'd be great.
I'm Polly Jones, I'm from Trussell. So as a trade unionist and working for a big NGO, I'm really interested in what you've all been talking about this morning. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about what this looks like. What does this look like in practice now, where different coalitions and organisations are coming together to work on common issues? What could it look like? And if you want to do it in karaoke style, that would be fantastic.
You kind of only have yourself to blame for that. And we'll maybe take a couple of questions and then come back to the panel just so as we can fit a few in. I can see Jamie over here and then Innocent over here.
Thanks very much. Great contributions. I just wanted to touch on a big trend. It's not a new trend, but it's a big one of late, which is that we're seeing a real organisation of vested interests fighting back against many of our campaigns. Ahead of the Scottish budget next week, we're seeing no shortage of pushback in terms of tax divergence in Scotland or the like. And while we can't outspend those organisations, I certainly think we need to outthink them, but would be really interested to get your thoughts on how we counter that quite organised counter campaigns that we're seeing across, whether it be climate action or tax justice, for example. Thanks.
And finally, Innocent.
Well, my question really is much more related to what extent does climate change help tackle or mitigate poverty in a very practical sense, other than theorizing? Thank you.
So three big questions, and I'm going to just go along the table. That maybe seems the easiest and fairest way. So Ros, will I start with you, if you'd like to come to any of those questions?
Okay, thanks. So I'm not going to do this in karaoke, by the way. Although my karaoke number would be four non-blondes revolution, I think. So, a couple of practical examples of working together. Yesterday I was on a demo and lobby at the Scottish Parliament with workers from Grangemouth, and they and their union Unite have a plan that requires investment from both the UK and the Scottish Government to use the existing workforce and the existing machinery they have in their plant to start to produce biofuels, which the airline industry is going to be crying out for. There's going to be a 3,000-fold expansion in the need for this fuel. We could become a world leader, but it requires significant investment, and it requires them upsetting a billionaire by taking his company off him effectively. So not insurmountable things that we're asking them to do. But there was a green bloc in the march. So we had the workers from Grangemouth who work in an oil refinery marching side by side with young people from Friends of the Earth and other organisations in that green bloc. And at the end of the day, their plan was about coming up with a green transition, but one which protected the local community, protected the workforce, and is also going to be good for our economy in real hard terms, but also good for our planet. So to me, that's a really practical example of some of the conversations, and you could see that starting when COP took place in Scotland. Another example is our trades councils. We've been putting a lot of work into trying to rebuild our trades council network. And trades councils are like local little sort of versions of the STUC. All the local union branches can join the trades council. And in honesty, they've been dying over the last 40 years. They tend to have a couple of 80-year-olds and their dog in them, and a few members of the Communist Party. Not that there's anything wrong with the Communist Party, but they're not vibrant, alive, they're not representative of their community, and they're not really connected to their community in a lot of cases. But what we've seen over the past couple of years is actually, I've seen some great examples at Clydebank and Paisley, who were out campaigning in Erskine when the far right were targeting migrant workers at the hotel in Erskine. Up in Moray, we had a similar situation where a lot of young people joined the Trades Council and started campaigning there. We've seen it down in Dumfries and Galloway now, where they've built up some really active links to local community groups and organisations. And as a start, it's really good to see the young people pouring into these trades councils. They're using them for local community campaigns. They're taking campaigns to their local authorities now about budgets. Glasgow Trades Council do loads of work with environmental groups about their free buses campaign, for example. So there's a lot of good stuff happening out there, but I would love to see more linkage there. And I think on the other things, for me, you know, how do we sort of counter the messages that are coming? Because the business lobby are very sophisticated. You know, we've got sort of really strong lobby and people that like to keep our governments in line. I think you do have to get out there and shift the public narrative. So the STUC spent many years very busily and very earnestly lobbying government and going to lots of meetings with government and doing lots of things. And I suspect sometimes Civic Scotland does that. We all got sucked in a bit to all these meetings with government ministers, and wasn't it great that they wanted to talk to us all? But what has that really achieved? You know, has the gap between the rich and the poor get less? Have we managed to tackle in-work poverty? Have poverty figures changed significantly for all the talk? Not enough. So, you know, we are doing a lot of work now to try and make sure that we actually are out there. And there's no point in us meeting a minister or making all the arguments inside the corridors of power if we're not out there engaging with the media, whether it be social media or the mainstream media, actually trying to shift public opinion and bring the debate out into the open. And apart from anything else, just to let people know, trade unions still exist. We're still in there fighting the good fight. And this is what we think about stuff, and this is why. So, you know, I think we all need to get a bit more public and a bit more out there with our arguments and with our campaigns, and we can all do that, whether it's in local newspapers or on you know, whatever social media platforms it is, and influencing and everything else. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
Thanks very much. Danny.
Yeah, I've got two songs, one by Air Supply and the other is Think by Aretha Franklin. So, no, I'm not going to sing, but I do want to talk about Air Supply in answer to the third and the first question, which is, so I'm a trustee at the Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation, which is an urban health foundation in Lambeth and Southwark in South London. You know, really urban, highly unequal boroughs of London. And over the last few years, we've been doing some work on air quality, which in some ways is a classic, this is Laura's point, but my version of Laura's story, which is a classic air quality sort of climate change sort of topic, but it's also inherently about poverty. Because all the research that we and others did showed that the people who were suffering from poor air quality most were the poorest bits of those communities, because they were most exposed, they had the worst sort of insulation, a whole range of factors. Huge cost to them in terms of their lived experience, their life expectancy, huge cost to society because of the costs of treating those people who, of all the symptoms that they were getting, and of course huge cost to society because of the costs of poverty to the economy, right? These are people who are not then able to fulfill their full potential. And what came together to take action in that borough and in London on air quality, I think, was exactly as Laura described it, this really fabulous coalition of people and actors who ranged from climate activists who are angry about fossil fuels, fossil fuel cars and trucks driving through an urban centre like London, groups of citizens who had organised, with the help of Citizens UK and others, to come together around this, minoritised ethnic communities who were angry about what was happening in their communities, who were also getting informed. The hospital itself, talking about the costs of poor air quality to healthcare and the pressures it's placing on an already stretched budget, and of course independent civil society institutions, including foundations like ours. And by coming together, a whole bunch of things happened. Everything from the Mayor of London's low emission zone that you would have seen and read about, controversial but hugely important in reducing fossil fuel cars and vehicles, all the way to we worked with, to talk about your tyre example, once the sort of fossil fuel emissions and carbon dioxide was dropping, the next big issue was other particles, some of which were being created by the treads of tyres from trucks, delivery trucks. And so we worked with the biggest fleet operators in that part of London to change the tyres that their trucks were using to reduce particulate emissions. So it's having that, if we wouldn't have had that level of success or that sophistication of approach without that coalition of unusual suspects. And then just on think, very briefly on Jamie's point around how, in some ways, those people who want to dismantle the things that we all stand for, many of us stand for, have outthought us. I think it's exactly right. If I think back to the founding of the New Economics Foundation, the worry then was that there was this sort of ideology that was the state is bad, markets are good, we have to dismantle everything about the state and set markets free. Simple set of ideas that if you look really far back, in the 1960s and 70s, right-wing philanthropists in America, starting with economics faculties, starting with journals, starting with newspapers, started to imbue public thinking, our thinking, state is bad, market is good. And they have outthought us. And I think the challenge back to us is, what's our response? What's our intergenerational approach? If we're thinking in 40 years' time, what do we want society to think? And I hope it's about, if we're going to claim to be a civilized species, we have to look after each other. To look after each other, we need meaningful social protection, which means we need a functioning and effective state, which means we need to have a tax base or a resource base that provides that. And, it's that sort of ideological battle that we need to fight, and we need to fight it now, but with the long term in mind.
Thank you, Danny. Laura.
I'll just say one quick thing so we could get to more questions, hopefully. But I think just on the last one, actually, I think it's it's clear how climate change impacts people, and particularly people in poverty, whether it's who's impacted by flooding or has the resilience to build back from that, or damp and mould or air pollution. And that's globally, but also here in Scotland. But the question I want to ask, and this is also a request in terms of collaboration, is can you all also help us make sure that climate policies don't make poverty worse as well? Because I think there's a real risk that we put things in place to help the environment that actually have a knock-on effect to people. And as a climate person, we need your expertise to make sure that happens. So we'd love to work together on that.
Thank you very much. Excellent answers. And again, I think many of those points that have been raised, we didn't plan this, but are coming up in the workshops that will follow about how we get into some of those issues. I think Rose's point about that balance between working inside government or working with government and working outside and holding them account is really important for us. And I think we have reached perhaps some of the limits, testing the limits of how far we can go with that sitting inside with government, and we need to flex the muscle of outside again. Time for a couple of more questions. So one here and then one right at the back. So, and because I saw your hand go up really quickly, I'll take one more here.
Thank you. Joe McCready from Care Scotland. I've got two direct questions, if that's at all possible. Danny, a question for you, and I don't want you to spoil your book, but I was just wondering if you're in your work, if you've seen any good examples of power being put to disabled people and their carers. We see a lot, but they're disenfranchised from participating in politics. I'm just wondering if there's any good examples of that. And a question to Roz, you spoke a lot about participation, about working with the first sector. I think with the National Care Service, I understand it's not a perfect bill, there's a lot of issues with it, but there's some things in there that are really vital for carers and for unpaid care, where it's a right for a break, Anne's Law and stuff like that. So I think it would be good to see you continuing to ask for that as well as asking for the other things that you're asking for. So that's just a separate point maybe rather than a question. Thank you.
And then at the back. Yep, go for it, Chloe.
Hi, it's Erica from Citizens Advice Scotland. My question is, how do we use social media to tell our story and send out our message? I think we've all seen how the incredible power of this new form of media and the way in which it feeds on legacy media but at the same time shatters it. So how do we use it to our advantage?
Okay, and I think there was another question here, Chloe, just at the table right in the middle. And then we're going to squeeze in another quick question, and I think, Davy, you might have something from folks online as well, yeah? Okay, so once we get this question, we'll go over here, and then you've got like 30 seconds each to answer all these complicated questions.
Hi folks, John McCafferty from Scottish Communities for Health and Wellbeing. I'm channeling my inner primary 7. Why?
Oh no, don't.
Why doesn't our government work for us?
And there's a question for the rest of the
I think we've run out of
afternoon.
time, actually. It's,
Well done, Laura. So we've got one final.
Hi, I'm Rudy from Oxfam. My question is also probably too big. And you all talked about organising in very different ways, but you all talked about coalitions and working together. But how do we stop coalitions becoming too unwieldy and too big? Because obviously, Laura, you talked about bringing lots of people in. So how do we do that effectively with lots of voices in the room?
Brilliant questions. And one final one here, Chloe, just from online, from Davy.
Hi folks, I'm David Eyre, the Communications Officer at the Poverty Alliance. But this is a question or a comment really from Catherine Hughes from the live chat and the live stream. Just maybe picking up on that point about maybe asking what do we think about the idea of a formal campaign network here in Scotland to develop connections and assist others to help empower a community of individuals and the skills they need to be more effective to make change.
Thanks, Davy. So there's a lot there. There's an awful lot there. We've got, I'm going to say 10 minutes. Have we got 10 minutes, Ruth? Is that okay? And people can still have a very quick coffee? Maybe 8 minutes, right? Okay. Okay. So the clock's ticking. Laura, we'll start with you this time.
Sure, and I'll just maybe answer the ones that I think are most relevant to me. So in terms of social media to tell stories, I'll give you my fun fact, which is TikTok. I know I go on about it, but people do think it's like a silly little app for dancing. For the last 3 years in a row, TikTok has overtaken Google as a search engine. It's where people are going to Google, well, TikTok, how to boil an egg. Also, what's a trade union? What is...
Texas.
Texas. That'll be me.
Charlene's on TikTok.
Yeah, so I'll follow it. But I think we need to take seriously that people are not sitting waiting for the 6 o'clock news or getting the morning paper, and that's where they get all their information. So we do need to be embracing these spaces. And I think my advice would be find an authentic way of telling your stories, find a creative way that works for you or your organisation or your community, and it will look different. Try it out, find a way. And I think just use as authentic voices as possible. I think any organisation that's got anything remotely corporate is just not interesting anymore. People don't want to follow it. So just really try and lean into that. And particularly on the disposable vapes campaign, I would go out and litter pick vapes and film it and do a chatty video and talk about it. And it created a buzz on its own. And then I had BBC News, Sky News, STV wanting to come and interview me because they'd seen it. And so don't always think you need to wait for the media to be interested or the politicians. Go and make the interest, for yourself. And I think in terms of coalition management, I mean, I don't know if this is the right answer, but in terms of the vapes, again, we made this amazing coalition and invited lots of people in. And once it serves its purpose, it stopped. Like we didn't need to keep meeting. We didn't need to keep going on about it. And we all meet in other spaces. So don't be afraid to close down a coalition once you feel you've addressed a problem, or move it on to something else or change it and adapt it. I used to work, for a big charity, and I think we were in lots of coalitions, and sometimes I was like, I'm not really sure what I'm doing here, but I'm here on my staff time, so just think about that. And why doesn't our government work for us? I don't know, but I think I want to address the young people and politics from the beginning, because I don't think we've got good people going into it. We do have good people going into it, but we don't have enough, particularly young people going into it from council level all the way up. So I want to try and address that first.
Thanks, Laura.
To Joe, so in the book I do talk a bit about examples like the Equal Care Cooperative, which tries to address the issue about pay and conditions for care workers, about adequate provision, but importantly it's about voice. Like, how do we create structures, whether it's a cooperative or a consultative body, that dignify the people who we're working with? And so that's the sort of example for me that is inspiring, because it's actually doing things. It's building a cooperative that gets stuff done with inclusion hardwired into it. On social media, I think maybe a different angle is we're not going to get the public space, the digital public spaces we deserve, unless we re-regulate these spaces better. Like, how come the public space that, the agora in which life is supposed to happen is now digitized to a large extent, but it's highly privatized, and worse still, we are the commodities. So we're thinking we're participating in democratic life, but we're being monetized so that Elon Musk gets even richer. That's crazy. But what's crazier is we can avoid that, because all we need is some states to get together and regulate these spaces, or better still, make them mutualized or non-profit. And it's possible. Look at spaces like Wikipedia, which is run by a non-profit foundation. So we can have highly successful digital initiatives that have these sorts of spaces that then at least don't have algorithms that make the whole thing much worse and almost impossible to have a meaningful discussion. On the state, ultimately what the state needs to do is discipline capital. Like your man Adam Smith said that a while ago, right? We've forgotten that. And I think the state won't work unless we discipline the state to discipline capital. And we're paying the price for 40 years of the state failing to discipline capital. That's my take on it as an economist. And then finally on the campaigns, there's an African proverb that you've probably heard a lot, which is, if you want to walk fast, go alone. If you want to walk far, go together. And I think that's for me, sometimes we've got to move quickly, and sometimes that probably means just going it alone, because you've just got to, a small group of people have to make the decision really quickly and take a risk. But if you really want impact, then you need to work in coalition and go together. But we just need to be clear about when which strategy works, because sometimes we want to go fast and then we create a coalition and we go nowhere. So there you go.
Rose, final word.
Thanks, Peter. Well, what I would say is completely agree with that idea that agility is sometimes the enemy of breadth, and there's always a tension there. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Campaigning, policy can be messy at times. It's never perfect, but there are times when you really need broad coalitions to make real change happen. National Care Service Bill, I appreciate what the colleague said there. There was lots of good things about it, but there was more bad that outweighed the good for us to be able to support it. It wasn't worth spending the amount of money that was going to get spent on it. But I'm happy to have the debate with you offline about that. The social media stuff, we need to get a lot better at it. I know that for sure, because capital is very, very good at using it to their ends, and profitising it and commercialising it, and it can be a force for massive good as well. And that brings me to, why don't our governments work for us? Well, they don't work for us because they work for the rich and the powerful, and they work too much for capital, and that's because when you've got money talks, money equals a lot of power. But I think what we always have to remember is there is no power greater than people power, and we are more powerful than we can dare to imagine. I think it was Nelson Mandela said that. And sometimes we just have to lose our fear of exercising the real power that we have when we come together. And it's not pretty, but it can make a big difference. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rose. I think there's a lot of lessons for us to take and to consider over the next few hours as we're discussing together. But the key one for me there, out of what everyone was saying, is that we need to be better organised. We all absolutely need to be better organised across civil society, whether that's in the trade unions, whether it's the third sector, whether it's faith bodies. We need to be working together better. So hopefully throughout the day, some of what we'll end up with at the end of the day is how we do that. I was struck, Danny talked about this long-term vision. There's something called the Powell Memorandum in the 70s, I think, before Reagan was elected, possibly even before that, that set out this is where the right wants to go, this is where capital, this is where big money wants to go. And largely, it's been implemented. That was a long-term, 50-year horizon around the Powell Memorandum, and it really influenced the direction. We see the same thing happening perhaps in the States at the moment with Project 25, but I think we need to be thinking at that kind of scale. Like, if the kinds of change that we want to to see happen aren't going to happen in 6 months. They aren't going to happen in a year. We need to be working for them long term. So hopefully what we've had this morning, I think what we've had is some of the elements of how we start to make that change. And we're going to continue that discussion in our workshops, which are just coming up, which, as you can see, will touch on all of those issues that we've discussed this morning. So building from the grassroots up, how we hold that space of policy, what do coalitions look like, and digital, how do we use digital? So we're going to go into these questions in more depth. It's on your badges, on your lanyards, about which room you'll be in this morning, so hopefully you can follow the directions to the Carrick, Kilsyth, Tinto and Harris suites. You've got probably, I think, 9 minutes. Ruth, you're keeping me to the minute for these, for a quick coffee. So grab a quick coffee or a cup of tea or some water and move on and keep the discussion going. But before you do that, thank you to all of our speakers this morning, Laura, Danny and Royce. Thank you very much.